Hi, I'm Malika Bilal, filling in for Fimi OK, and you're in the stream. Today, the United Kingdom remains intact after Scotland rejects independence. But how will the cracks in the new relationship be mended? Our guest digital producer, Omar Bazaar, is here looking out for your live feedback. And Omar, one thing I remember from our last Scottish show was that the community has a lot to say about this.
You know, very passionate, and the referendum for independence may be done, but the issue for some is actually far from over. There's the hashtag We Are the 45%, which references the 45% that voted for independence, and for them the issue is still ongoing. We have Katie here who tweeted in saying the 45 plus rally on November 29th is coming up. They have a poster for the rally, and at the bottom it says let's keep the momentum going. For those of you at home, we want to know what you think is next for Scotland, so tweet us using the hashtag that you see right about there. AJ Stream, and we'll try to get to those tweets during the show.
We'll delve into Scotland in just a minute, but first, here's a look at some of the hashtags we're following around the world. Breaking up is hard to do, and on Thursday, Scotland voted against secession. The Better Together campaign won at the polls by a comfortable margin of 55% to 45%, but the union with England has clearly been shaken. Scotland faces a long and possibly bitter road ahead. On Sunday, Alex Salmond, Scotland's outgoing nationalist leader, said his fellow citizens were tricked into a no vote by British political leaders who promised them increased powers. Britain's three main parties pledged Scotland more autonomy just days before last week's vote. Now Prime Minister David Cameron is facing doubts from his own party, as well as his political rivals. So how does Scotland go about the process of reconciliation? And will London be able to follow through on its promise of devolution? Well, joining me now from Edinburgh to discuss the way forward, Stephen Gethens. He's chair of the Scottish Global Forum and former advisor to Scottish Nationalist Party leader Alex Salmond. In Glasgow, Gregory Philo is Professor of Communications and Social Change at the University of Glasgow and a campaigner for Better Together. Ted Simpson is a student at the University of Edinburgh, and Lindsay Kroll is a student at the University of St. Andrews. Welcome to the stream, all of you. I did hear a little, no, I'm not, Professor.
I've never campaigned for Better Together. No, never. Well, I certainly was in favour of a no vote, and I wrote things on it, but I thought Better Together was a terrible campaign, a crazy idea to put three party leaders together with all like that. I mean, it was just such a mad thing to do. It just made it look like this bunch of bankrupt, worn-out old politicians all arguing one side, and then you had sort of all the fresh, new Scotland on the other. It was a catastrophe. I mean, I thought the Better
I agree with Greg.
Campaign.
Well, Greg, did you knock on Greg as part of the campaign? And I hear that disagreement. So, Greg, as part of the campaign, did you knock on doors to try to get people to come out to vote either way?
I spoke to loads and loads and loads of people, and I obviously wrote a lot. I wrote on different websites and things. But mostly I talked about what I thought were the difficulties and problems, particularly in relation to universities. I was very concerned about what might happen to higher education, as were very many of my colleagues. And there were surveys and things that were done of international students, for example, which showed that 50% of them said they wouldn't come to an independent Scotland. But I mean, I'm not taking sides on that, but that was the result of the two surveys, and that would have been absolutely devastating to hear. And all the scientists here were very worried about cuts in their budgets, right, and about the effect of losing. There was lots of reasons why I was involved.
Right. Well, Greg, as you were speaking, Stephen was shaking his head. Now, Stephen, I'm interested in what the mood is for you and where you are in your area of Scotland.
Sure.
And before I get your answer, I want to pull up this tweet that I found online. This is a comedic take on what happened. Reinstalling Scotland. And there you see Union Jack, the flag, and it's missing some parts of it. But Scotland is being reinstalled. How does that make you feel?
Well, look, 45%. Do you know the first thing that I'm going to say, and I think we can all agree on tonight, and I want to trumpet Scotland to the rest of the world now we have the opportunity in Al Jazeera, which is 86.5% of the population who could vote voted. And given that when you've in Western democracies you see a lot of the voter turnout going down, that was fantastic, and I'm sure we can all agree that that was a great thing. And the energy and the commitment and the knowledge that people brought, to be fair, from both sides of the debate was absolutely fantastic, and it made me quite proud of the debate that we had. So I was quite pleased with that. And also 45% of the vote, given that we were behind in the polls throughout and started off much lower than that, was a significant achievement. Now obviously I'm disappointed we didn't quite make it over the 50% threshold, but I'm very proud of the campaign that we fought.
So basically, when we're talking about what the sentiment is like on the street, you know, Malika, there were a couple of scuffles there in George Street, and then we had actually a video comment sent to us by Lois, who's talking about what the feeling is like. Take a listen to this.
The recent violence we've seen in George Square can be attributed to a minority. I'd say the real tension is in the unspoken grudges between friends and colleagues. Now everyone you see when you walk down the street, were they yes or were they no? I just think a lot of people feel hard done by after the result on Thursday.
Ted, do you think that's a fair way to describe what the sentiment is like right now? There are a lot of grudges between people who would otherwise be friends over this vote?
I think grudges is potentially a bit strong, but there is definitely an air of divisiveness that I would say spawned over the last couple of weeks of the campaign. But it is certainly palpable. I mean, I walk to university every day, and you'll hear stations about the referendum still going on. And as would always be the way with such a vote that went so close, 45-55, it's a very, as Stephen said, it was a very close call. So there's always going to be people that feel, that they've just missed out on a massive opportunity.
So, Lindsay, I want to bring you in here, as a yes voter. Were there any positives of this outcome at all for you?
I think, in general, the campaign was very positive. As Stephen's already said, we polled at 25% at the beginning of the campaign, and at the end it was 45%. And I think it is the increased political engagement we've seen, especially amongst young voters as well. Everyone's talking about politics now. Everyone's talking about moving towards a more equal society. What can be done differently? I think that's one of the main positives, and also the fact that the Yes campaign came from kind of grassroots activism as opposed to being backed by kind of major government resources, and that was a huge positive to take away for the Yes campaign, that they did manage to kind of rise through social media, through personal campaigning, to get such a result. I think that's still a positive result for the campaign.
Well, Greg, you heard Lindsay mention her positives. Are you in a celebratory mood?
I think in one way it was very positive, in the sense that people from outside this country said to me it was an extraordinary sight to watch a country potentially, the UK, potentially break up. And people said to me it was amazing. And somebody said that that America would never allow that. They wouldn't allow Texas to have a vote about whether they should become an independent country, or California or whatever. It just wouldn't be allowed. And I think the fact that it could be allowed here, and that everyone took part so vigorously, and that there wasn't any violence. I mean, I think there was bad feeling, and people got very heated and terribly wound up in it. But there was nothing like what might have happened, or what people might expect to have happened. And it was in that sense a real exercise in democracy. I think, given that it was about democracy, if you forgive me saying so, I think if the yes vote had won, even by one person or 1%, I think they would have immediately gone to a to setting up a new nation. And they wouldn't have worried that 49% didn't want it. And they would have been outraged if the 49% had then said, we're going to set up a reunion party to try and overthrow the referendum.
Stephen, Stephen, do you want to respond to that?
True. Can I come in on this, because this has been a myth that's been perpetrated from the No campaign, who were could be extraordinarily negative throughout this campaign, and the violence you talked about in George Square was by those who backed a No campaign the other night as well. Now, Alex Salmond, who was the First Minister, who is the First Minister of Scotland at the moment, before the referendum took place, the first thing he said when he was said, if there's a yes vote, we will invite the leaders of every single political party, whether they back a yes vote or a no vote, to come together as a Team Scotland and work together, because that is representative of the democratic wishes of the people. Now, since there's been a no vote, I see the Scottish Government has even now said, well, of course, we will work together and we will look at how we can take things forward. So actually, the Yes campaign was far more conciliatory and far more forward-looking. You never got anybody from the No campaign talking about taking the leader of the SNP or the leader of the Greens on board afterwards. So a little bit of a disappointing remark from Greg here, I feel.
Campaign. No, I take your point, Stephen. I was referring to the 45 campaign and the big rally that was referred to earlier on. And it seems to me, I've had a lot of arguments with people saying that this was all supposed to be about democracy. So why are you telling me that the struggle must go on and that we must overthrow the referendum? Now, I'm not saying that is the politicians, but there's a strong feeling on the street that that's the case.
So precisely, actually, on this point, there's the question of why actually the vote turned out the way it did. And we have Glenn here who tweeted in saying, when the yes looked like they were set to win, Cameron made an 11th hour pledge on maximum devolution, NHS, education, swing polls back to swing polls back to the no. And he goes on to say now that Wales and Northern Ireland and English regions want the same deal, it's looking impractical, and that's why now there's going to be backpedaling on those promises. Ted, do you have any confidence that devolution is actually going to proceed at this point, or do you feel like those promises are going to be undermined on some degree?
I think it's perhaps too much of a cynical view to take. To accuse Westminster a couple of days in of already backpedaling. I think the fact that 86% of Scotland came out and voted on this issue makes it almost too big to ignore. And I can guarantee that on both sides of the ballot, people will be wanting to see a change in how the country has won. And that's reflected within England and Wales as well. I don't think that's necessarily just unique to the Yes campaign. Everyone is disenchanted with the current political elite, and everyone would like to see a change. And I don't think that sort of turning to a divisive tactic and claiming that Westminster won't fulfil these goals is overly negative at a point where, in fact, we should be pushing the positive. I mean, we've seen the effects of such a positive campaign for the last 3 months. Yes has been incredibly aspirational and has got a lot of people involved in politics that previously weren't. I think
you were a first-time voter as well, correct?
Yes, I was. Yes, first time. So you know that it's completely galvanised an entire population, and including. It's worth noting that according to the Lord Ashcroft polls, anyway, if you drew a line after 64 and above, so if you took the votes from ages of 16 to 64, Yes would have actually taken it. So that's an entire generation of people who are currently unhappy with the political system. And that in itself is too big to ignore, I think. I feel like the referendum was as much a referendum about an independent Scotland as it was a referendum on Westminster.
Right.
And change must come, I think. I think it's too big to ignore.
Well, Stephen, speaking of Westminster, you know, the pledges of new powers and basically devolution, is that enough to satisfy pro-independence voters?
Well, let's see. I mean, the signs we're seeing so far are not promising. Can I say one thing about democracy? That the Prime Minister and the leaders of the two other big political parties at Westminster came up about 8 days before the polls had closed, at which point about 700,000 people had voted by post already, and then they put a sort of new deal on the table at that point. And I think that was a bit unfair on those who had already voted by post. Still, what we've seen over the weekend is, after giving us this big promise of lots more powers, and a lot of people voted on the basis of getting new powers, after that, after all those promises, the parties started falling out with each other and internally. So I think we're seeing a bit of backtracking already, and I think that's very, very disappointing.
So,
do you not? Sorry, I'm sorry.
Yeah, actually, I'll be coming to you, Greg, in just a moment. Actually, I just have a couple of tweets to read for you real quick. We have Sean here who tweeted in saying, in the aftermath of the vote, there is some resentment and lots of people are regretting the no vote. But we have Stephen here, on the other hand, who tweeted in saying, I don't regret voting no, and have not met anyone who has. In truth, the Devolution pledge probably wasn't bought by most of the electorate anyway. So, Greg, do you think that that promise of devolution actually was instrumental in the vote turning out the way it did, or do you think it would have been a no regardless of it?
My judgment is no, because when I was out talking with people generally, I thought it was a bit of a gimmick to say more powers for Scotland, because when I spoke to a lot of people were a bit unclear what the powers were we had already, and had no idea at all of what the new ones would be. And if you actually speak to most people about what it means to have, a devolved tax and spending or something like that, or what Scotland will do about the budget deficit, I mean, their eyes glaze over. I mean, they really don't. It's not something that really, really motivates people. They like the idea of Scotland being more powerful. So there's a sort of switch between hearing the phrase "more powers for Scotland" and then people thinking, "Oh, that's great, it'll make Scotland more powerful." But it wouldn't necessarily at all. It's just a devolution of decision making, which actually is potentially quite dangerous, because if you apply that right across the island on which we live, you can already hear the noises from places like London saying, "Ooh, that's quite good," and you can hear the rich in the home counties and people saying, "Well, can't we become a city-state and decide what policies we're going to have on taxation, like we don't want to pay a lot of tax or something," So you can see it's actually, there's all kinds of very difficult issues involved in devolving power to regions.
What would an ideal devolved Scotland look like? Lindsay, what would it look like to you?
For me, I'd want to see kind of more powers handed over to the Scottish people in terms of, I mean, when I say greater control over taxation, it's very difficult to kind of distinguish between what Devo Plus and Devo Max, for example, come up with. And with the promises that Westminster have given, I'm not necessarily convinced that they didn't outline it in the last few days, and they still haven't underlined exactly what the changes are going to be. I also would want to see a protection of the NHS from privatisation, more control over welfare, but the focus has already also moved to constitutional questions in England as well, seeing English powers for English MPs, which I think will also slow down the process a lot more as well. When, I think maybe going back to like the previous question, I'm not convinced that the promises will be held, and especially not at the timetable that they've set, because logistically it's going to be a lengthy and complicated process, and there's going to be a lot of drawn out debate with the three main parties, particularly. Especially if the Conservatives, there's a lot of infighting going on at the moment in the Conservative Party, and David Cameron can't guarantee the support of his own MPs.
Not to mention elections are coming up.
So, but in terms of whether the independence movement is actually done with altogether, or whether there's still room for it to move forward, to put out that question, we have Ian here who talked to us on Facebook saying, Scotland hasn't rejected independence forever, only for now. The media keeps painting the clear majority for the no vote as indication that Scotland wants to stay in the UK. That's definitely not the case. And then we have John here who tweeted in saying, the senior citizens of Scotland contributed to the no vote. In 15 years' time, demographics will change. Stephen, do you see the possibility of this vote coming up again in another 10, 15 years or 20 years and having a different outcome?
It possibly could. Let me touch on two things that might be of interest to you and people watching the programme. The first one was on Wednesday last week, the day before the poll came out, the Herald, which is the oldest English language newspaper in the world, wrote an editorial. In the editorial it backed no. But what it said, it said, we back no, but if we don't see change and we don't see substantial powers coming to Scotland, then we will campaign for yes. And although I campaigned for yes and wanted to see independence last week, I think that's the feeling of a lot of people who voted no, and I think the Herald, even though I disagreed with them at the time, made a fair point. The other thing is, since polls closed on Thursday night, the parties who backed independence have seen a surge in membership. Now, the Scottish National Party was already the biggest party in Scotland, and in just 3 days, more people have joined the Scottish National Party than are members of the entire Scottish Labour Party, the second biggest party in Scotland. So there's clearly an appetite for change. I think it's up to parties like the SNP to really put the pressure on Westminster to make sure they deliver. And if Westminster doesn't deliver, then they've got the people of Scotland to answer to.
Well, Ted, speaking of that appetite, where do the passions for those who were campaigning on either side, where do those get channeled into next? What happens to that emotion, basically, in those first-time voters like yourselves? Will you stay politically active?
Well, I think it's really important and to continue on engaging the population, especially the younger people who voted for the first time. But I think it's sort of the responsibility of parties like the SNP, who are obviously seeing a surge in popularity, to actually keep being positive and to keep pushing forward for greater control for Scotland. Not necessarily for independence, however, because democracy has spoken. You know, the majority of the population has come out and resoundingly said no. So it would be a cynical political move to sort of tread water for 15 years and hope that in 15 years we can continue to push for an independent Scotland. I think it's their responsibility to actually unite the population and ride this wave of political activism and positivity and aspirational politics, you know, and get young people involved so that we can see a fairer Scotland within the Union, which I think is what the majority of people in Scotland would be happy with.
Greg, I want to get your reaction on this tweet that came in from Mark, who says, Salmon's abandonment of the yes voters has left no one to rally and gather them to move on. Hence, they are stuck and heartbroken. Do you echo that sentiment? Do you feel like the leadership of the yes vote should be trying to help their base essentially move on and just accept the fact that they've lost this? What is your take on this?
Well, I guess we could all do with some therapy after that year. But to be honest, I think this has, in a sense, been a distraction. It seems to be what the problem facing the UK, and indeed almost all the population of the world, is that there is a phenomenal, extraordinary, stunning concentration of wealth into the hands of a very small number of people. I mean, you know, Picardy has shown that in his book, and it is an amazing phenomenon. So in this country, in the UK, the personal wealth of the top 10% is £5 million close to now. It's £5 trillion. Well, a quarter of that would pay off the entire national debt of the UK. Now, in order to make those people pay tax properly, to pay wealth tax, you actually have to have a strong central state. Now, just giving powers to Scotland, I would say, isn't actually going to do that, because the oil money, which people talk about so much, is actually, the revenue is rather small. It's about 6 billion a year at the moment, so about half of 1% of the GDP. But the £5 million, which is in the hands of the top 10%, that would solve pretty well all the problems of the whole island. Even a tiny portion of it will. And that is what has to be addressed. If you go for devolved powers, just, you know, to Wales, to Scotland, and then other areas, like, for example, you know, Yorkshire, the north, and then the home counties, you make London a city-state, you will never be able to challenge that power. It's simply impossible, because you will have given tax raising and spending powers to all different regions.
Greg, it sounds like Lindsay wants to jump in. Lindsay?
I just think kind of prior to the referendum, there was absolutely no talk about constitutional change in Westminster. And there was no thought that, yes, Scotland could actually gain the support that it did. And the reason that there's now talk of constitutional reform is because of the success of the Yes campaign. And I mean, the way that British politics were going prior to that was towards right-wing policies and towards...
Lindsay, I'm going to have to end you right there. It's really just a pause. We'll pick up on that point and see what Greg has to say to that in our post show, because that's all the time we have for the main show. But first, on the next program, there's an overwhelming scientific consensus on the world's climate problem. However, very little is being done to address the issue. Can the planet afford any more political theater when it comes to solving the problem of global warming? Until then, we'll see you online. Welcome back. Scotland has rejected independence, but what does the path toward reconciliation look like? And can the UK fulfill its promises of devolution? So we're going to get right back to the conversation. I had to put Lindsay on pause, but Lindsay, pick up where you left off.
Yeah.
Okay, so I was kind of pointing out how the UK had been moving towards very right-wing politics for the past few years, and that's been, has caused the UK now as one of the most unequal countries in Europe in terms of its GDP, and there's high levels of poverty, I think about 20%, and it's predicted to rise. So we see all this social inequality and all this wealth focused, as has already been said, that all this wealth is focused in the elites and corporations, and that's created such an unequal society. And prior to the referendum, there was no talk of change. So I think that's the main point I wanted to make, was that that's a key success of the referendum.
Yeah.
Well,
Can I come in? Yeah.
Stephen, yeah, actually, go ahead.
No, just one point I'd like to raise, and this might be interesting context for your viewers, is that Scotland and England are in a voluntary union. The Treaty of Union between Scotland and England, we're in a voluntary union. One thing that was interesting through the campaign is it wasn't just Scots who were campaigning who said that the UK is unfair as it sits with so much power and economic wealth sitting down in the southeast of England. One thing that fascinated me was a lot of English people came to Scotland to campaign for Scottish independence as a good thing, say, for the north of England. For example, Billy Bragg, who's a fantastic singer-songwriter, Peter Kilfoyle, who's an MP in Liverpool, and even the mayor of Carlisle, which is one of England's most northernmost towns, were all in Scotland campaigning for Scottish independence to create greater fairness across these islands and to see a rebalancing. Because if you have a strong Scottish economy, and Scotland is a very rich country with higher GDP per head than the rest of the UK or France and Japan for that matter, then you automatically create opportunities for our colleagues and our friends in Newcastle, Liverpool, Manchester and other cities in the north of England, as well as a much more healthier relationship with London, just as Ireland now has a much more healthier relationship with its partners in the rest of these islands.
So we have actually somebody commenting on this. I'll be coming to you as well, Greg, in just a moment. We have Michael here who tweeted in saying that I don't think this referendum will change British-Scottish relations, but it will very much change Scottish voters' approach to the Labour movement. And then we also have Elizabeth here on Facebook who commented about this phenomenon of the growth of pro-independence parties. She says, pretty much everyone in my feed has joined the Scottish Green Party. The party has pretty much tripled in size over the weekend. This never happens in politics. Greg, I know you wanted to make a comment, but if you can add to that also your take on what explains the growth of these pro-independence movements. What explains it in your your opinion?
Well, the pro-independence movements are a lot of people looking for an alternative. I thought it was the wrong alternative, because although I don't doubt in any way the motives of people who wanted a fairer society, what is happening is that by decentralizing, you're creating the possibility of the richest areas of the country and indeed the planet simply setting up gated communities where they control all the wealth for themselves and leave out other people. I mean, it's all very well saying Scotland's got tremendous resources, but what about that South Wales where there isn't oil? I mean, how can that really help them? So they depend upon a strong state to actually redistribute wealth. But the effect of what we're doing is now to promote a kind of regionalism whereby all the different areas of the UK will demand their own powers. And they will say, well, if Scotland can say they will not be subject to the laws published elsewhere, like on the NHS or whatever else, then we want not to be subject to central laws as well. So we don't want capital gains tax. We don't want wealth tax. We don't want a higher rate of income tax. Just imagine, the regional parliament in the home counties and London coming up with exactly that as a policy. They would, the people there, or majority of the people there, would think it was wonderful.
Stephen?
Yeah, sorry. On a point of fact, Scotland and England are two different jurisdictions, so you can't have the same laws and have their own lawmaking ability. Secondly, they were talking about what people were motivated was having decisions about Scotland made in Scotland. Now, you talked about the Ashcroft poll earlier on. That's what people overwhelmingly voted for. Decisions made in Scotland that were about Scotland, made in Scotland. That was backed by communities the length and breadth of the country, including Polish people for yes, Scots Asians for yes, Africans for yes, every community, 350 community groups who were driven by wanting to bring power back to Scotland, but also internationalise Scotland, especially at a time when the UK seems to want to withdraw from the EU and Scots want to remain in the EU. We want to make Scotland an international hub and bring it back into the international community of nations.
Well, Ted, moving this forward just a bit, Ted, I want to push this forward just a bit and get your thoughts, Ted, on the future of Scottish-English relations and whether or not for you or for those in your friend circle and your families, whether your identity and whether your thoughts on what it means to be Scottish or British have changed.
I think in a way it's almost too early to tell. But what has puzzled me about the referendum is that there are people in England that feel exactly the same as Scottish people, but they've been given this opportunity to almost have a platform to say that they do not agree with what's currently happening in Westminster. And what frustrates me slightly is that everyone in England feels the same, or at least the vast majority of my friends down south do anyway. So from there on in, I don't understand why there's suddenly a divide between the Scottish and the English, because English people will be just as happy to see reform. I don't see why suddenly Scottish people are making a case that they are more socially just. I think it's a slightly disingenuous claim.
Well, Stephen just shook his head at that.
Yeah, I do. I mean, look, the Ashcroft poll I mentioned, there's about decisions that are about Scotland being made in Scotland. Now, Scots often don't get the fact, regularly don't get the governments that they vote for, so there is a bit of a democratic deficit here. And what Scots have shown is that this is about,
apart from 2010, the last three elections were in favour of the Scottish vote. The last Prime Minister was Scottish. The last two Chancellors of the Exchequer were Scottish.
It doesn't matter what the ethnicity of the Lance Chancellor. It doesn't look. The ethnicity of the particular politician doesn't matter. The will of the people matters. Now, at the last election. So can I answer this question?
Stephen, Ted, Greg, I'm going to have to pause you there. I hear all of the division. We're going to have to take that conversation online. You can use hashtag AJStream, and we'll both be looking out for your tweets to see where this conversation ends up. But I want to thank all of my guests. Stephen Gethens, Gregory Philo, Ted Simpson, and Lindsay Kroll. Now, before we go, I'd like to get closing thoughts from the community because I know that they had lots to say in the midst of that.
Sure, we have Jamie here who tweeted in, who still believes in independence, saying, if human beings gave up every time we were unsuccessful, we would have never have stood upright. But we also have Amy here who sees something positive in everyone, regardless of where you stood on this. She said, this encouraged a democratic debate with everyone, from children to pensioners. Politics are firmly alive in Scotland, probably something everyone can appreciate.
Right, I saw a lot of nodding heads among our guests. So just enough time to tell you about our next show. On our next program, there's an overwhelming scientific consensus on the world's climate problem. However, very little is being done to address the issue. Can the planet afford any more political theater when it comes to solving the problem of global warming? Until then, we'll see you online.